He offered her money to forget the pregnancy, but she chose love and disappeared. 5 years later, the billionaire CEO sees her again, this time with twins who look exactly like him. Hello everyone, lovers of mystery and drama. If you've ever been underestimated, this is the story for you. A story of betrayal, redemption, and the power of claiming your own destiny. Hit like, subscribe, and get ready for a night that will change everything. Alexander Black had built his empire on precision, control, and the unwavering belief that everything had a price. From the top-floor office of a steel and glass tower, he looked down at the city like a man surveying his kingdom. At 32, he was already a legend in the business world, a self-made billionaire whose blonde hair and striking blue eyes had become as recognizable as his name in the pages of luxury magazines. However, beneath the admiration and envy, Alexander remained convinced that love, trust, and all the fragile emotions ordinary people clung to were nothing but distractions. Money could buy loyalty, power could demand respect, and success could silence pain. Or so he told himself. When Sofia Guzman had entered his life, she had been an interruption to that careful order. Dark-haired, soft-spoken, with blue eyes that conveyed warmth instead of ice, she had disarmed him in ways he didn't expect. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or the circles he moved in. She had wanted him for who he was, beneath the armor he wore. For a time, he had allowed himself to believe that he could love her, though in truth, he had never truly let go of his obsession with control. That fragile illusion shattered the night she approached him with trembling hands and a voice that vibrated between fear and hope. She told him she was pregnant. The words should have sparked something tender in him, should have brought him closer. Instead, Alexander's mind immediately spun to risk, to image, to the headlines that could threaten his reputation, to the chaos a child could bring to the meticulously ordered life he had built. Panic hardened into coldness as he looked at her. He didn't yell or curse. He simply resorted to the one solution he had always trusted. From his desk drawer, he pulled out his checkbook and placed it on the table between them, his blue eyes empty of emotion. "I'll take care of you," he said in a voice so calm it felt like cruelty. "Whatever you need, whatever it costs, I'll cover it. You won't lack for anything." To him, it was generosity. To her, it was betrayal in its purest form. Sophia's heart shattered in that moment. She had come expecting reassurance, the warmth of his arms, the promise that love would anchor them both in the storm of uncertainty. Instead, he had reduced her life and the life growing inside her to a transaction, a problem to be solved with money. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from clarity. She saw the man before her for who he really was, brilliant, powerful, but empty in all the ways that mattered. Her voice was quiet but firm when she replied, "I don't want your money, Alexander. I wanted your love, and if you can't give me that, then you've already lost us." She pushed the checkbook back toward him, her hand steady, even though her chest was breaking inside. He didn't stop her when she left. His pride wouldn't allow it. His arrogance whispered that she would come back, that no one ever walked away from Alexander Black. But she didn't return. She vanished from his world that night, her silhouette dissolving into the city streets as he remained in his office, staring at the untouched checkbook on his desk. For days he told himself he had done the right thing, that he had avoided weakness, that success required sacrifice. But somewhere deep down, buried under layers of denial, a voice whispered that he had lost something irreplaceable. He silenced it with work, with endless meetings, with late nights spent expanding an empire that suddenly felt hollow. What Alexander didn't know what his pride wouldn't allow him to consider, was that Sophia wasn't just leaving him. She was also leaving the life he had chosen. She carried within her the future he had rejected, 2 children who would never know their father's embrace, 2 lives born from the love he had been too afraid to claim. And as Alexander continued to build his fortune, believing that control made him untouchable, the decision he had made that night would haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. What do you think was worse, the cruelty of his money offer or his inability to see love? Leave your opinions in the comments. Sophia's world crumbled the night she walked out of Alexander's office, but she refused to let it destroy her. She carried not just her own future, but the future of the 2 tiny lives growing inside her, and that knowledge forced her to find a strength she never knew she had. The city that had once felt so bright now seemed cruel and indifferent, but she learned to navigate it with a quiet determination that hardened with each passing day. At first, she found herself working long hours in a small cafe, scrubbing dishes and wiping counters until her hands ached, saving every dollar she could. The nights were the hardest when she returned to her tiny rented apartment, curled up alone, and felt the twins moving inside her. In those moments, she would whisper promises to them, promises that they would never feel unwanted, that they would never feel the sting of rejection the way she had. When the twins were born, Sophia thought the pain of childbirth would consume her, but as soon as she held them in her arms, the fear dissolved into something overwhelming and unbreakable. Adrian and Leo were perfect, 2 tiny boys with tufts of blonde hair and big blue eyes that cut through her with joy and sadness. They were the mirror of their father, the man she had loved and lost, and for a moment the sight of them almost broke her heart all over again. But then they cried, and their fragile fists reached for her, and she knew they were hers in a way that Alexander could never take away. Whatever mistakes she had made, whatever wounds she carried, through them she had been given a second chance at love. The first few years were brutal. Sophia worked 2 jobs, one cleaning offices at night, and another at a hotel reception desk during the day. She barely slept, often running on pure willpower and coffee, but she refused to falter. Every time she thought she couldn't handle another shift, she reminded herself of the 2 little faces waiting for her at home. She learned to stretch every dollar, to cook cheap meals, to sew up ripped clothing instead of buying new. Yet, for all the exhaustion, there were moments of such pervasive happiness that she knew it was all worth it. Watching Adrian take his first steps across the living room carpet, hearing Leo's laugh fill the air like a melody, seeing them cuddle against each other in their sleep, those moments made the sacrifices bearable. Still, there were nights when Sophia looked at her sons and felt the ache of the past. Their eyes were Alexander's, a clear, sharp blue, and sometimes it felt as though he were staring at her through them. She wondered what it would have been like if he had chosen differently, if he had held her that night instead of pushing her away with money. She wondered if he would have loved these boys, if he would have felt proud of them. But each time those thoughts crept in, she forced them aside. She couldn't afford to think about a man who had abandoned her. Thinking about him was a luxury she no longer had. All that mattered was giving her sons a stable, secure, and love-filled life. As the years passed, Sophia began to regain a sense of balance. At the hotel where she worked, her dedication was noticed, and she was given more responsibility. She learned to manage her time with precision, waking before dawn to make breakfast, hustling through her shifts, and returning in the evenings with enough energy left to sit on the floor and play with toy cars or read bedtime stories. Though her life was far from glamorous, it had a purpose, and she clung to that purpose fiercely. There were moments when loneliness haunted her. She had friends, kind colleagues, and the occasional neighbor who offered to watch the boys. But there was no one to share the weight of her burdens with, no one to lean on when she felt like she would collapse. And yet, when she looked at Adrian and Leo, she found her strength renewed. They were her anchor, her light in the darkness. She often told herself that perhaps this was the life she was meant to have, a life of quiet struggle, but one where she was surrounded by the kind of love Alexander had been too blind to value. What Sophia didn't know was that time had a way of unearthing the past. Though she had worked so hard to bury every memory of Alexander, her son's resemblance to their father made it impossible to completely forget him. Every laugh, every smile, every piercing glance from their blue eyes reminded her that her story with him wasn't over the way she wanted it to be. And deep in her heart, though she would never admit it, she feared the day destiny would force her to face the man she had once loved and the father her sons had never known. Does true love always find its way back, or should the past sometimes stay in the past? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe. 5 years passed in what felt like both a blink and an eternity for Sophia. The days blended together, a constant rhythm of work, sacrifice, and moments of fragile joy that only her children could bring. Adrian and Leo were now 4, energetic and inseparable, always running hand in hand, finishing each other's sentences as if they shared not just blood, but a single spirit. Their laughter filled the small apartment where Sophia had created a home for them, a place that might not be filled with riches, but overflowed with warmth. She had built a stable, if exhausting life, and in many ways she believed she had made it. The boys were never hungry, they were never short on love, and they never felt their father's absence, at least not yet. Her job at the hotel had become more than just a job. It was her second home, a place where she could count on a paycheck and some respect. She had proven herself to be reliable, professional, and resilient, qualities her manager valued. Guests often commented on her calm demeanor, her ability to handle difficult situations with grace, and her quiet smile that seemed to reassure even the most demanding travelers. But underneath that exterior was a woman who had long ago given up on her own dreams. She didn't think about romance, about what it would feel like to be held by someone who saw her as more than a hard-working single mother. All of that had been buried the night Alexander offered her money instead of love, and she had locked those hopes away as tightly as she could. The boys were growing quickly, and with each passing year, their resemblance to their father grew deeper. Strangers would often comment on their striking blue eyes, eyes so vivid and penetrating, they seemed almost too intense for children. Sophia would force herself to smile in those moments, but inside, it felt like a reminder carved into her soul. She could never fully escape Alexander's presence, even though she hadn't seen him in years. Sometimes, late at night, she would watch her son sleep and wonder if he ever thought of her, if he ever regretted the decision he had made. She hated herself for asking those questions, because the answers couldn't change the reality she lived with every day. Despite the hardships, Sophia was beginning to believe that maybe destiny would allow her a quiet life. She didn't need greatness or wealth. She only needed the sound of her sons' voices and the small joys of ordinary days. She imagined them starting school, learning to read, and running home to tell her about their adventures. The world she had built was modest, but it was hers, and she held on to it fiercely. Then, one afternoon that started like any other, destiny acted. The hotel lobby was buzzing with guests arriving for a corporate event, and Sophia was behind the reception desk, focused on checking people in with her usual efficiency. Her sons were with a trusted babysitter, and she was thinking about what story to read them before bed. She barely noticed the tall figure who strode into the lobby until her gaze instinctively rose, and her breath caught in her throat. Alexander Black was there. He looked almost unchanged, and yet completely different. His blonde hair was still perfectly styled, his custom-made suit cut to perfection, his blue eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who owned not just the building, but the city itself. But now there was something on his face, something sharper, as if the years had etched lines of unease and weariness into his features. For a moment, Sophia thought she must be imagining it, a ghost conjured by her own exhaustion. But when his gaze met hers, steady and unyielding, she knew he was real. Her first instinct was to look away, to retreat, but her body froze. She couldn't move. Not when the man who had once broken her was only a few feet away. He seemed caught, too, his expression faltering as if the air had been knocked out of him. And then his eyes drifted past her to the glass doors, where two small boys had just entered, running to greet their mother with shouts of joy. The babysitter had brought them by, eager to see her for a quick goodnight kiss before heading home. The moment Alexander's gaze landed on Adrian and Leo, the entire room seemed to fade. He stared at them as if the earth itself had opened up, revealing a truth he had never prepared to face. Two boys, identical in their golden hair and striking blue eyes, stood next to Sophia. They looked at her with adoration, and then, with curiosity, they looked up at him. The resemblance was undeniable, so marked that even strangers in the lobby turned their heads, whispering. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to shield the boys, to pull them away, to hug them and disappear before Alexander could fully register what he was seeing. But it was too late. His expression told her that the recognition had hit him like a lightning bolt, searing and irreversible. For the first time since she had known him, the powerful, untouchable Alexander Black looked utterly undone. What would you do if you were in Sophia's situation? Would it be a second chance or a trap to escape? Leave your opinion in the comments. Alexander's world tilted the moment his eyes met the boys. For years, he had lived with the certainty that his decisions were final, that his past with Sophia was buried under the weight of success and the relentless forward march of ambition. Yet now, standing in the middle of the hotel lobby, with the gleam of chandeliers above, and the murmur of businessmen and tourists swirling around him, all that certainty dissolved in an instant. Two pairs of blue eyes, so unmistakably his own, stared back at him with the innocent curiosity of children who didn't yet understand what kind of storm was brewing in the space between the adults. Sophia felt her heart thunder against her ribs as she pulled the boys closer, their little hands gripping her arms, their faces alight with the sheer joy of seeing their mother. She wanted to get them away before Alexander had a chance to speak, before he could use that dominant presence to break into the fragile life she had built. Yet she couldn't move, her body caught in the invisible tension of his stare. The memories came rushing back, the night he offered her money instead of love, the way his cold voice had cut everything between them, the months of carrying their children alone, telling herself she had to be strong. And now, here he was, looking not at her, but at them, as if he were seeing his own reflection multiplied and brought to life. The room had fallen into an awkward hush. Guests who had moments before been engrossed in conversation now exchanged glances, their eyes flicking between Alexander, Sophia, and the boys. Some whispered under their breath, sensing the drama without context, while others pretended to look away, though curiosity drew them in. Alexander barely noticed. His steps carried him forward almost against his will, each movement slow, deliberate, as if he feared if he moved too fast, the vision before him might shatter. Sophia straightened, her voice a whisper of steel when she finally spoke. "Don't," she said firmly, her body moving protectively in front of her son's. "Stay where you are." Her tone was quiet, but the authority in it froze him mid-stride. He stopped, his chest heaving as if he had run means to reach her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his eyes searching hers with desperation, with questions, with guilt. Then his gaze returned to the boys, and his lips parted as if to form words. But no sound came out. Adrian tilted his head, curiosity shining on his young face. He tugged gently on his mother's sleeve and whispered with the unthinking innocence only a child could carry. "Mommy, who's that man? Why is he looking at us like that?" Leo mimicked his brother's stare, his blue eyes wide and cautious, but neither boy felt the magnitude of the moment. To them, he was just a stranger. To Alexander, they were the living embodiment of everything he had lost. He finally found his voice, though it was rough, unsteady, stripped of the authority it used to carry. "Sophia," he began, and the single word carried both recognition and regret. He swallowed hard, his throat tight as he tried again. "Are they?" He couldn't finish the question, couldn't bring himself to say the words that were already written on their faces. Sophia's spine stiffened. Her hand smoothed Adrian's hair, her arm wrapped around Leo's shoulder. Every part of her posture radiated protection. Her reply was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. "They are mine, mine alone." The words rang not as a denial, but as a warning, and Alexander winced as if he had been struck. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The hum of the hotel returned in snippets, the clinking of glasses, the rolling of suitcases across marble floors, the distant sound of an elevator chiming. But for Alexander and Sophia, the world had narrowed to a single, unbearable truth. He saw himself in the curve of the boys' jaws, in the set of their shoulders, in the breathtaking clarity of their eyes. He knew without a doubt that they were his sons. And Sophia, meeting his gaze with unyielding force, knew that he understood too. The weight of the revelation crushed Alexander's chest, the guilt rising in him like a tide too strong to hold back. He wanted to talk, to explain, to plead, but the words felt meaningless compared to the 5 years he hadn't been there. 5 years of first steps, first words, scraped knees, and quiet nights that he had missed. He had imagined his success made him untouchable. But here, before 2 little boys who carried his blood, he had never felt so powerless. Sophia gathered her strength, pulling her sons gently toward the exit. She wouldn't let him see her tremble, wouldn't let him claim any ground in the world she had built without him. As she walked away, Alexander's gaze followed her, burning with a mix of desperation and nascent shame. For the first time in his life, the man who had believed everything could be bought understood that there were things beyond his reach, things he had thrown away with his own hands, and that no amount of power could easily restore. That night, Alexander didn't return to his penthouse with the usual satisfaction of closing a deal or the comfort of being in control. Instead, he lay awake in a bed that suddenly felt too big, staring at the ceiling as the image of 2 little boys with blonde hair and penetrating blue eyes replayed endlessly in his mind. He couldn't escape the truth that stared back at him in their faces. He had seen his own reflection, multiplied and softened by youth, and it had shaken him to his core. For years he had convinced himself that walking away from Sophia had been the right choice, that money was enough to solve what he considered a mistake. But the weight of that lie now pressed on his chest so hard he could barely breathe. His thoughts went back to the night she had told him about the pregnancy. He remembered the fear that had turned to anger, the pride that had blinded him, the cruel certainty that love was a weakness. He had watched her leave, telling himself she would come back when she realized she needed him. But she didn't. Instead, she had built a life on her own, raising 2 children without his help, without his presence, without his name. And now those children were old enough to walk, to laugh, to balk, to ask questions, and he had not been there for any of it. The realization hit him with an almost physical pain. The following days only deepened his torment. He attended meetings, nodded through presentations, signed contracts, but his mind was elsewhere. Every face he saw reminded him of theirs. Every child he passed on the street made his chest tighten with the thought of what he had missed. He imagined Adrian and Leo's first steps, their first words, their birthdays, moments that had belonged only to Sophia, moments he could never get back. For the first time in his life, money felt completely useless, a hollow currency that could not buy back time or erase regret. Unable to bear the silence of his conscience, Alexander sought Sophia out. He would wait outside the hotel after her shift, approach her in the lobby when she passed, try to catch her when she was alone. Each time, his voice would falter, stripped of its usual authority, replaced with desperation. He would plead for a chance, even a moment with the boys. "Please, Sophia," he said one night, his words rough with exhaustion. "Just let me see them. Let me explain. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't ignore this anymore." Her reaction was not anger, but something far more piercing, quiet, controlled, and impenetrable. She looked at him with those deep blue eyes, the same eyes she had passed on to their children, and she shook her head. "You offered me money when I asked for love," she said, her voice low but firm, each word cutting with precision. "You turned your back on me when I needed you most. I won't let you do the same to them. They don't deserve to be broken by you the way I was." The words left him shattered. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on never letting anyone see weakness, but standing in front of Sophia, stripped of excuses, he felt exposed. He realized she was right. His absence had not just hurt her, it had defined his sons' lives. They had grown up without a father because he had chosen pride over responsibility. That truth was unbearable, and yet it was one he couldn't deny. At night, he wrestled with his guilt, pacing the halls of his penthouse as if the silence mocked him. He thought of his own father, a man of stern principles, who had taught him that strength meant never showing vulnerability, never bending to emotion. For so long, Alexander had believed that creed had shaped his life, but now it felt like a prison he had locked himself in. Sophia had begged him for love, and he had mistaken her plea for weakness. The irony was cruel. In trying to protect his empire, he had lost the one thing that could have given it meaning. The more he thought about Adrian and Leo, the more the emptiness inside him grew. He wanted to hear them laugh, to hold them when they cried, to be there when they needed someone to guide them. He wanted to be their father, not just in name, but in truth. And yet, he knew that wanting alone would never erase the past. If he wanted even a chance at redemption, he would have to prove himself in a way that went beyond words, beyond money, beyond power. He would have to show Sophia and the boys that he was no longer the man who had let them go. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one afternoon, when Sophia brought the boys to the hotel lobby after her shift. She had no intention of letting them stay, but Adrian spotted Alexander before she could lead them away. The boy's curious nature had always made him brave, and with an innocent smile, he slipped out of his mother's hand and walked up to the tall man in the custom suit. Alexander froze, his pulse hammering, as the boy looked up at him with wide, unsuspecting eyes. There was no suspicion in that gaze, only a puzzled fascination that disarmed him more than any accusation could have. After a long pause, Adrian tilted his head and spoke with an objective certainty that left Alexander breathless. "You have eyes just like me." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Sophia's heart clenched as she hurried to pull Adrian back, but the words had already been said, and they reverberated in Alexander like a bell ringing in a vast, empty chamber. He slowly crouched down, lowering himself to the boy's level, his usual arrogance gone. He didn't know how to talk to a child. He had no practiced charm to fall back on, but something raw and instinctive guided him. His voice was low, almost reverent, when he answered. "Yes, I do." Sophia wanted to intervene, to cut the fragile thread forming between them, but she couldn't bring herself to. Leo had joined his brother now, standing close with cautious eyes, and the sight of the two boys together, looking up at Alexander as if searching for a connection, left her moved. She had spent years preparing to protect them from him, but in that instant, she realized the choice might not be hers entirely. Children had a way of seeing truth with a clarity adults lost. And whether she wanted it or not, the truth was written plain on all three of their faces. From that day on, the boys asked questions. They weren't demanding, but their curiosity was persistent. Who was the man in the lobby? Why did he have the same eyes as them? Why did he look so sad when he saw them? Sophia tried to evade, to explain away the encounter with half-answers, but the boys sensed the hesitation as easily as they sensed affection. Finally, she allowed Alexander to see them again, under her watchful eye, because she realized that forbidding him entirely would only bring up more questions she couldn't answer. Alexander approached with caution, as if every moment might be taken from him. He came without the shield of his wealth, without gifts or grand gestures, only with the tentative humility of a man trying to win back what he had lost. At first, he fumbled with the simplest things. Reading aloud from children's books felt strange. He mispronounced words. His voice was uneven, but the boys would laugh and correct him with the authority only they possessed. When they wanted to play catch in the park, he found himself clumsy and uncoordinated, unable to keep up with their boundless energy. Yet, they laughed harder when he missed, and in their laughter, he discovered a joy he had never known in boardrooms or high-rise towers. Sophia watched all of this with cautious eyes. She expected him to falter, to give up when it became inconvenient or when his pride took a hit. But to her surprise, he kept showing up. Day after day he would return, not as the polished CEO who commanded respect from the world, but as a man who was striving to learn how to tie shoelaces, how to patch up scraped knees, how to listen when a child explained the intricate rules of a made-up game. Slowly, her sons grew used to his presence. Leo, the more cautious twin, took longer to open up, but eventually even he leaned against Alexander's side as they watched cartoons, as if testing the strength of the bond that was forming. For Alexander, each of these small moments was a revelation. He had missed so much, years that could never be returned, but the simple weight of a child's head resting on his shoulder was worth more than every contract he had ever signed. At night, he still wrestled with guilt, but now there was also hope, fragile, tremulous, but undeniable. He began to believe that maybe redemption wasn't beyond him, that perhaps his son's love could stitch together the broken pieces of his past. Sophia, however, remained guarded. She couldn't forget the man he had been, the pain he had caused, the coldness with which he had once rejected her. Yet, as she stood in the living room doorway one night, watching Alexander struggle to keep both boys on his lap while reading a picture book upside down, she felt something shift inside her. He was no longer the untouchable billionaire who had once chosen pride over love. He was a man who learned, who failed, and who tried again. And despite herself, she began to see the sincerity in his effort. She was terrified to hope, but a part of her wondered if change was truly possible, and if the man she had once loved was buried somewhere beneath the layers of arrogance and fear. By the time the boys had fallen asleep that night, snuggled on the couch with their heads against Alexander's chest, Sophia realized the walls she had built around her heart weren't impenetrable after all. She reminded herself she wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But as she pulled a blanket over her sons and watched Alexander look at them with tears silently welling in his eyes, she could no longer deny the truth. The man who had once turned his back on them was now fighting for a place in their lives, and slowly, impossibly, he was beginning to win it. What did you think of this part? Do you think Sophia should forgive Alexander for the sake of the boys? Sophia had never intended to give Alexander a chance back into her life. Yet weeks of his persistence and the boys' growing attachment made it impossible to ignore him any longer. She told herself she was only allowing this for Adrian and Leo, that they deserved to know their father in some form, even if she never trusted him again. But as the days passed, she began to notice the quiet transformation in him, a change so profound it unsettled her. He no longer carried himself with the same rigid pride that had defined him. Instead, there was a humility in his movements, an uncertainty in his voice, and a willingness to let go of control when it came to his children. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Sophia found herself sitting across from Alexander at the small kitchen table in her apartment. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but he was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his usually confident blue eyes darkened with something she had rarely seen in him. Fear. His voice was low, stripped of its authoritative edge. He admitted that he had been a coward, that when she told him she was pregnant all those years ago, he had panicked and chosen money because it was the only language he understood. He told her he had convinced himself that he was protecting his empire, protecting the image of strength he had worked so hard to build. But in truth, he had only been protecting his own pride. He confessed that not a day went by now that he didn't regret it, didn't think about the years he had lost with his sons. Sophia listened, her arms crossed, her heart torn between anger and a reluctant compassion. She remembered vividly the cold look in his eyes that night, the way he had slid the checkbook across the desk, as if she and their children were nothing more than a nuisance. His apology, as raw as it was, couldn't erase that memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, but with an edge of bitterness. She told him that his absence had not just hurt her, but had forced her to carry a burden no woman should have to face alone. She spoke of the nights she had worked until dawn, and still returned home to care for 2 infants. She described the moments she had felt so weak she thought she would collapse, but had kept going because she had no other choice. She reminded him that while he had been building his empire, she had been building 2 lives without a father. Her words hit him like blows, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he let them wash over him, his jaw set with each phrase. When she was done, silence filled the room again, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he lifted his eyes to hers, and there was no trace of defense, only desperation. He told her that he couldn't undo the past, and that he didn't expect forgiveness for himself, but he begged her not to punish the boys by keeping him away. He said they deserved to know their father, not the man he had been, but the man he was trying to become. He promised her that he would not leave again, no matter how hard it got, no matter how much she doubted him. Sophia's heart ached as she looked at him. She wanted to believe his words, but faith was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. She had spent years learning not to rely on anyone, especially him. Yet she couldn't ignore the way Adrian and Leo's eyes lit up when Alexander walked into the room, or the way they laughed more freely when he was around. They had already begun to love him, and she knew she couldn't take that away from them. Still, she warned him that one mistake, one sign of faltering, and she wouldn't hesitate to close the door forever. She told him plainly that she couldn't stand to see her sons broken by the same man who had broken her. Alexander nodded, his expression solemn. He told her he understood that he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of them. For the first time since she had known him, she saw a man stripped of all the armor he had built around himself. There was no arrogance left, no indifference, only a fragile sincerity that unsettled her because it was real. That night, after he left, Sophia stood by the window, looking out at the city lights stretching endlessly below. She thought of the years of loneliness, the battles she had fought alone, and the man who had once abandoned her, who was now returning with empty hands, asking for a chance to be a part of what she had built. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but for the first time, she allowed herself to consider that forgiveness wasn't just about him, but also about freeing herself from the weight of the past. And though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, a small part of her wondered if the story she believed had ended long ago was only beginning again, written not in pride and betrayal, but in the slow, painful language of redemption. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it the promise of change. The city shook off its chill, and with it, Sophia found herself loosening the tight hold she had kept on her heart for so long. Weeks of Alexander's constant presence had begun to create a rhythm in their lives, a rhythm she had never dared to imagine. The boys now asked for him every morning, their voices filled with excitement, their eyes bright with anticipation. They spoke of him as if he had always been there, weaving him naturally into their games, their stories, and their dreams. Sophia watched this unfold with both fear and awe, realizing that despite all her efforts to protect them, Adrian and Leo had already let their father into their hearts. It was during one such evening, when the air was warm and the scent of blooming flowers drifted through the small garden behind their building, that something irrevocable shifted. Sophia had brought the boys out to chase fireflies, their giggles echoing against the stone walls, while Alexander sat nearby, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, watching them with a tenderness she had never seen in him. He didn't talk much, didn't try to impress her with grand words or gestures. He simply watched, as if the sight of his sons running freely under the twilight sky was the most precious treasure he could ever possess. When Adrian tripped and scraped his knee, Sophia moved instinctively, but Alexander was already there. He knelt in the grass, scooping the boy up with a gentleness that was surprising, brushing the dirt away with a surprising patience. His voice was quiet and reassuring as he comforted him, pressing a kiss to his forehead before carrying him back to the garden bench. The sight seared itself into Sophia's chest. She had imagined 1,000 times that he would fail, that he would become impatient or indifferent. But what she saw instead was a man discovering the simple, selfless joy of fatherhood. This was not the Alexander she had once known, but someone transformed, shaped by regret and determination. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep with the fireflies still glowing in a jar by their bed, Sophia walked into the quiet garden again. She found Alexander still sitting there, looking up at the stars with a contemplative expression. For a moment, she simply stood in the doorway, watching him, remembering the man who had once been untouchable, who had seen her pregnancy as a bother, who had believed money could silence love. This man looked nothing like that. His shoulders were no longer squared with arrogance, but heavy with humility. His eyes no longer cold, but softened by the weight of what he had almost lost forever. She walked to him slowly, the gravel crunching under her feet, and he looked up, surprised by her presence. There was a silence between them, the kind of silence that held more than words could say. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She told him that she didn't know if she could ever erase the pain of the past. She didn't know if forgiveness was something that could be offered so easily, but she had seen enough to believe that change was possible. She admitted she had been afraid to hope, afraid to let him back into their lives. But seeing him with their sons had shown her something undeniable. He was trying, and not for himself, but for them. Alexander listened without interruption, his jaw tight, his eyes moist with unshed tears. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice cracking as he promised her once more that he would never abandon them again. He told her he had lived in a gilded cage for years, surrounded by everything money could buy, but starving for the one thing that mattered. He said the boys were his second chance, and she was his anchor, the only person who had ever seen through the facade to the man underneath. He asked for nothing more than the chance to continue proving himself worthy, one day at a time. Sophia's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice. She had spent years building walls to protect herself, but those walls had already begun to crumble, not from words, but from actions. Slowly, with hesitation, she reached out and placed her hand over his. It wasn't a gesture of full forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. For a long time they sat together under the stars, their hands linked, the silence between them finally peaceful instead of suffocating. Sophia realized then that the story she had believed had ended years ago had been transformed into something new. It wasn't the same love she had once offered so freely, untested and fragile. This was a love marked by betrayal, hardened by time, and reshaped into something stronger. Inside the apartment, Adrian and Leo stirred in their sleep, their small bodies huddled together under a blanket, their breaths even and steady. They would wake to a subtly changed world, a world where their father was no longer just a stranger, but a presence they could trust, and their mother no longer carried the weight of raising them alone. As Sophia leaned against Alexander's shoulder, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time in years. The pain of the past would never disappear, but it no longer had to define them. In its place, something fragile but resilient was growing, a new beginning, forged from regret, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. What did you think of the ending? Was the weight and pain worth it for Sophia and Alexander to have their second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of redemption and love.